thank you guys for joining. Today we have a very interesting talk by Geoff Crocker, who is actually the, tell me if I'm wrong, Geoff, but you are actually the coordinator, right, of the UBI Hub, and you are actively involved in UBI advocacy.
That's correct, yes. Yeah.
So you worked international technology strategy consulting for major multinational companies, government institutes, and now you headed the website, The Case for Basic Income, and you are also the author of Managerial Philosophy of Technology, which was released by Palgrave in 2012. And your most recent book is Basic Income and Sovereign Money, which is actually just released by Palgrave this year. So that's a very exciting opportunity for us to explore and discuss your upcoming book and recent research on basic income and sovereign money. As we were discussing, is an understatement to say that it's a hot topic at the moment. Everybody is talking about it, coming from the left, the right, to any kind of possible political, social, and disciplinary spectrum. So I don't want to steal more of your time. As you said, we basically expect to speak for about 35-40 minutes max, and then we will have Rajiv and Alan discussing a little bit, making basically some points. I will intervene only if necessary about the gender dimension of UBI, and then we will obviously give a chance to our amazing crowd of participants to discuss with you with the Q&A. Okay, so go ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lorena, for that introduction. Thank you to you and Susan and Alex and others for the introduction and the invitation. And thanks to the participants for the interest you've shown in joining in. As this first slide does show, this is work in progress. So it's not an attempt to give a sort of didactic lecture. It's sharing a hypothesis which is very much embryonic, which is in development, and therefore please in the discussion afterwards feel free to be as strongly critical of it as you would wish to, because I clearly would like to refine the hypothesis further. So on this title page, as Lorena has said, you'll see some links there to the website, The Case for Basic Income, to my recent book on basic income and sovereign money. And I am making quite a big claim that in combination, these two proposals represent an alternative to economic crisis, and they represent an alternative to austerity policy. The third link there is showing the Basic Income Research Project at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath, where we're testing in a postdoc 3-year project the hypothesis that technology is responsible for the creation of a need for unearned income. So, to move through the presentation, first of all, this is to outline the hypothesis which I am trying to make. And the hypothesis is, first of all, that automation in high technology economies is generating a structural need in the economy for unearned income. So that earned income is no longer sufficient either for aggregate demand or to fund consumer expenditure. This unearned income is coming in 4 forms. Essentially, that's pensions and dividends, welfare benefits, and household debt. This is creating further inequality because pensioners and shareholders are relatively well protected, but welfare recipients and households in severe debt with low income are not. And that increases inequality and also opens the economy to crisis. Now, the second point is that financial orthodoxy requires money to be backed by interest-bearing government bonds. And even now, the government is issuing significant funding for the coronavirus implications in the economy. They're still doing it by going to the gilt market. Those will be interest-bearing government bonds. Financial orthodoxy says that government budgets should balance, the deficits therefore have to be reduced, and therefore you get austerity by a reduction in government expenditure on welfare benefits and other programs. Basic income is I will claim, the necessary and best form of that unearned income. And sovereign money, which funds consumer and government spend, which creates no debt, imposes no financing cost, avoids inflation by observing the output GDP constraints. So it's not just sovereign money ad infinitum. It's not just, quote, printing money, as in the Weimar Republic, which everybody seems to have heard about, but it is a disciplined sovereign money, disciplined by output GDP constraint. We can consume what we can produce. And I argue that currently in the system we have inferior surrogates. In other words, household debt is a surrogate for the basic income that should be in the economy, and government expenditure deficits is a surrogate for the sovereign money that should be there. So that's the outline of what I now seek to unpack. Clearly, the current economic system, I'm sure we're all aware of this, demonstrates substantial elements of dysfunctionality. We're aware of crisis which happened 12 years ago and is always threatening to repeat. There is very pervasive debt, both household and public sector debt in the economy. We are subject to continuous austerity policy to try to get that deficit down. There is extensive poverty, including, as we all know, in work poverty because of low-paid jobs. Inequality is increasing and we are wreaking ecological damage. So with that level of multidimensional dysfunctionality, I think many of us will agree that a radical rethink is required and radical system re-engineering. So the current favorite explanation of the crisis is the bad guy theory, i.e. the crisis was caused by bad banks who created excess debt through derivatives and bad governments who failed to regulate. The correction that's been applied have been these three strategies: tighter bank regulation, increasing the loan to value and loan to income constraint, quantitative easing by pumping £435 billion of money into the economy, which we will critique, and austerity. But since these are not working, there's a reason to question the basic hypothesis, i.e. was the crisis indeed caused by bad banks and bad governments, or is there actually a structural explanation to the crisis? I do suggest that a hypothesis of simultaneous universal malpractice by all banks and all governments at the same time actually lacks credibility. So I then turn to alternative structural explanations of the crisis. Here's an attempt to very briefly show economic events and policy responses at a very macro level in the post-war period. So we'll be aware that in the period 1948 up to 2016, I will show a graph which demonstrates that earned income increasingly becomes insufficient to purchase GDP. And that unearned income in that period increases to compensate for that gap. But that unearned income does include consumer credit and household loans, wherein lies, of course, a significant problem because they peaked in terms of new loans in 2004 at £165 billion in the UK, leading to default. Over that period, in the right-hand column, we see Keynesian fiscal demand management in the post-war period, which we're all very familiar with, the need to focus on aggregate demand in the economy, displaced after the 1973 crisis by monetarism 1, as I call it, an attempt to control the quantity of money as the monetary theory. That proved increasingly ineffective because of the availability of plastic money, maxing out credit cards and so on and so forth, leading to what I call monetarism 2, i.e. the attempt to control the amount of money in the economy by controlling its price as the interest rate. That whole system led to the familiar crisis of 2007, since which the policies in the right-hand column have been those three I've just mentioned of tighter bank regulations, austerity, and quantitative easing, reaching 2.4 trillion euros in the EU zone, the Eurozone. During that period, household loans initially fell. These are new household loans per year. Welfare benefit incomes begin to fall, asset prices increase. And by 2017, which was the last data I had at the time of putting this together, household loans had gone back up again to £77 billion. Inequality is increasing and poverty is increasing. So a rough scope overview as to the phases that I'm suggesting we have been through. Now, this is the key slide. Other commentators like Adair Turner, Robert Skidelsky, Martin Wolf, and so on certainly finger debt as the main cause of the crisis. I'm arguing, and I'm indeed in correspondence with all of them, that we take a step further back and say, okay, but how did that debt come about? Because attempts just to constrain the debt are not going to be effective if they don't look at the real causes of it. So this graph, which I referred to earlier, does show consumer spend against labour income over a very long-term period from 1948 to 2016. And forgive me, I'm colourblind, but I think the top line in purple is showing labour income, earned income, and the bottom line, well, it starts off as being the bottom line in blue, shows consumer expenditure, all in constant prices over that period of time. And there is, I think you'll agree, a very clear, definite structural change going on over that long-term period, because we start off with labour earned income being sufficient to cover consumer expenditure. That changes in 1995 when earned income is no longer, labour income is no longer sufficient for consumer expenditure, and the two diverge significantly after that. Now, first of all, thanks to the ONS on this, they've been extremely helpful in getting this data together and corroborating it for me. So I have some confidence in its reliability. But what are the reasons for this? Well, one explanation is technology, i.e. that the amount of output available from an automated production system grows much faster than the labour needed to produce it, and therefore the wage going to labour and the earned income. And there are, of course, other explanations. That it may be due to trade union bargaining power, and it may be due to phenomena of globalization and outsourcing. My argument would be that the trend is so consistent over such a long period of time that certainly an important, if not the most important explanator is technology, which is leading to a position where the macroeconomy needs this unearned income. This graph then tries to look at it slightly differently by comparing output GDP on the top line with disposable consumer income in the middle line and household loans down below. And the claim is that you can see there that disposable income flatlines against a robust GDP growth in the period 2001 to 2007, i.e. leading up to the crisis. So disposable income grew by 16%, whilst GDP grew by 24%. Income is not keeping up with the GDP output in the economy. This could, of course, be due to higher growth in investment and government spend and net exports, but some of that gap is met by 52.1% growth in total household loans. It's unsustainable, therefore default, therefore crisis, therefore austerity, and meeting the gap with basic income will avoid crisis and austerity. Now, showing that a little bit more clearly in terms of matching the gap. The top line is the gap between output GDP and disposable income. So you can see the gap's growing all the time. And below is new household loans taken out in the year concerned. And my claim there is that the two follow pretty much the same curve, by the shape of the curve visually. It's not a terribly objective, rigorous measure, but visually those look to follow a similar pattern. So we see household loans peaking at 165 billion, reducing to about 4.6, and then inevitably, I claim, growing again to 73 billion by 2017 in order to fund necessary consumer expenditure, usually in low-income households. So the cause of the crisis is, I claim, underconsumption and debt. So the crisis is structural, not behavioral, and remedial policies of financial regulation, QE and austerity have been ineffective, and the crisis can repeat. And referring back to the 1930s crisis, of course, Keynes famously argued that low wages reduce aggregate demand and are in fact the cause of crisis rather than the resolution of crisis, which the neoclassical economists claim. Low interest rates may not be effective because of his theory of liquidity preference. And there's a nice article by James Devine in 1994 showing that stagnant US wages indeed led to increased household debt in that period. The 2007 crisis covered extensively by Skidelsky, Turner and Wolff. Debt, they say, is the problem. Household debt is for consumption and not to buy housing. So I'm suggesting this structural change, which consumption is the cause of due to technology, globalization and worker power. The second point, I've been trying to make the point so far that unearned income in the form of household loans is a surrogate for the basic income, which would be preferable. Now I'm making the point that the continual deficit that we observe as a surrogate for sovereign is a surrogate for sovereign money, which is essential to the system, demonstrated by the fact that it's basically still there. So this deficit is resulting from a lack of sovereign money in the system, and financial orthodoxy is reducing the deficit by imposing austerity, which can be avoided if government expenditure is funded by sovereign money. So this is UK debt as a percentage of GDP over that period of time, 1994 to 2017. As in many other countries, as we'll see in a moment, we have debts of 85%, 100%, and in the case of Japan, 234% of GDP, which it's a myth to claim are repayable. But they do impose a substantial annual interest cost in financing them of 39 billion a year in the UK, all to the financial sector. Clearly, compared to this deficit spending, sovereign money is debt-free, wouldn't incur this debt definitionally, and wouldn't incur its financing costs. So I'm claiming that financial orthodoxy imposes a false policy choice between deficit and austerity, i.e., according to financial orthodoxy, you can't have a deficit, and therefore you must have austerity. Sovereign money, on the other hand, avoids austerity and can be issued up to the constraint of output GDP. I'm throwing these points in, and I will amplify them in a moment. This is a similar picture of continual deficit in the G7 economies. And the claim I'm making is this is a widespread phenomena, i.e. that financial orthodoxy, which requires government expenditure and money issuance to be backed by debt-bearing bonds, produces this requirement to keep the deficit down and therefore leads to austerity. It's not just the UK economy. This is another familiar picture showing ever-increasing debt by country as a percentage of GDP on the y-axis. Japan is the famous case there, 244% of its GDP as its national debt. It's not repayable, and it needs to be redefined by sovereign money definition. So in all G7 economies except Germany, debt's greater than 100% GDP. It's a myth to say this is a burden to our grandchildren because it will never be redeemed. And the reality of this perpetual deficit should be redefined as sovereign money. So towards a new policy paradigm, the components of which are to replace household debt with basic income. Now, this is a suggestive element towards a solution. I'm not saying that this is a total solution or is necessarily totally workable, but I'm trying to demonstrate strands of logic which would form a new policy paradigm and replace government deficit and debt with sovereign money. So the argument from technology, people will be familiar with Brynjolfsson and McAfee's arguments from the second machine age, where automation will lead to these social unacceptable outcomes of unemployment, social exclusion, low economic demand, recessions, unsustainable credit crisis, and austerity. Basic income does offer to break this vicious circle, but the question then arises of how it's to be funded, and the proposed answer here is sovereign money. So to try to get us there, I offer this thought experiment. The thought experiment is a totally automated economy, i.e., I can plug a machine into the earth, it produces the total GDP of all goods and services with no labour and therefore no wage. Now, in this mythical thought experiment, the only way consumers could get goods and services would be by an annual voucher distribution by the state. In this case, the whole of the GDP becomes basic income because there are no wages. The whole of the GDP equally becomes sovereign money. It's debt-free, like coinage is at the moment, actually. The objection will be, yes, but this is just a thought experiment, it's not reality. But the nuanced argument from this is therefore that in high-tech economies, unearned or basic income becomes an essential component of demand. And I think the graphs earlier demonstrate that to be empirically true. And that financial deficit is equally inevitable because it's engaged and deployed as a surrogate for the missing debt-free sovereign money in the economy. This needs heterodox economic assumptions, i.e. that consumption, investment, consumer income, and UBI are all rendered affordable by output GDP, not by the public sector financial balance, which is only an intermediate variable. It's got to be managed in some way, but it shouldn't be a constraint. We can afford to consume, invest what we produce as output GDP. Secondly, that money has no inherent value, contrary to what financial orthodoxy suggests, but derives its value solely from output GDP. Sovereign state can create this money solely versus output GDP as the referent, not gold reserves and not the sale of government bonds. So I then look at the nature of money and the definition of affordability. So financial orthodoxy does have this view that money has inherent value by referring to gold reserves or the sale of government bonds, that money is in some sense real and can't be created or destroyed, and that government budgets must balance, so that affordability is defined by government financial reserves. The heterodox theory, however, says money has no inherent value, but derives its value, which is imputed to it, only by our output GDP. The sovereign state can issue money against this output GDP referential, and financial deficit of sovereign money is inevitable in high-tech economies. So affordability is defined by real resources and productive potential. And that's an attempt to show the same argument diagrammatically, which I won't go through in detail. So the monetary theory of money predefines money value and applies the affordability test, where the neo-Keynesian theory of sovereign money ascribes money value from output GDP. So to repeat, sum up, in the basic income hypothesis in high-tech economies is that unearned income is an essential component of macroeconomic demand, and that secondarily, basic income is the best form of that unearned income, and the financial deficit or debt-free sovereign money creation is necessary and inevitable. Very quickly, 4 other great reasons for basic income, which others have argued better than me, and that is human flourishing, i.e., if the technology is allowing us to live more free from work, why not? It might need a change of philosophy and practice, but it would allow flourishing. Ecological responsibility, because this breaks the link between income support that people need and more production and consumption, and therefore more pollution. So it's an ecologically responsible paradigm. And thirdly, it favours social justice. I refer to my friend Guy Standing in his book on precariat. And also it increases the administrative efficiency and effectiveness of welfare benefits. I.e., if you're going to have any welfare system at all, basic income is less intrusive, costs less, and has a greater take-up. The reasons people field against basic income, first of all, they claim it's a work disincentive, but actually it's current welfare systems that disincentivize work because they withdraw benefit pound for pound as a person engages in work. So the marginal rate of tax is huge. And the other objection is affordability, but as I've been trying to build a case, it's output GDP, not government funds, which determine the affordability of a basic income scheme. Other great reasons for sovereign money, and these are represented well, by my colleague Geoff Crocker, are that sovereign money returns seigniorage to the state. Instead of seigniorage residing with the banks creating credit, it goes correctly to the state. That's the difference between the value of the money created and the actual physical cost of producing it. It gives control of the money supply, and it reduces reliance on the crude and blunt interest rate as the only instrument of economic policy. Now, again, this diagram I won't go through in detail because it is quite complex, but I've tried to show, and I'll lodge that with you, a diagram of how money is created and how it flows through the economy. And I will just compare the links between pension insurance companies there and the central bank in the creation of QE by the purchase of government bonds, and compare that to the dotted lines, dashed lines, which are sovereign money, and QE for the people through a basic income. There are several definitions of sovereign money. One is the modern monetary theory definition, which is linked to job guarantee schemes, and Stephanie Kelton is one of the main proponents of this definition, which I'm supportive of, but which I have some disagreement with, i.e. that the sovereign money can fund a job guarantee scheme. Money creation must be matched by debt creation in this view, because the debt so created is balanced by other surpluses in other sectors and by a use of the so-called godly identity. Again, that would require more time to unpack completely. But in this definition, a zero interest rate creates no revenue financing cost. The view of sovereign money from Joseph Huber is that it's bank money definition. In other words, up till now, money is created by banks creating credit. That should be changed so that the state has a monopoly of money and commercial banks are no longer able to create excess money, so there will be no crisis. Compared to the definition I'm putting forward as a basic income definition, which is that sovereign money funds aggregate demand, it funds aggregate demand to the potential full output GDP. That's the reason for it. It's not matched by debt creation. I see no reason to logically require that, and therefore avoids excessive consumer and public sector debt, which lead to crisis and austerity otherwise. It also, of course, avoids interest payments, the 39 billion a year in the UK that I mentioned earlier. And that's a little table summarising those definitions and their contents of the author. So looking at UK anti-crisis policy in summary, bank regulation has been tighter. There have been tighter loan-to-value and loan-to-income conditionalities imposed, but new household debt has inevitably grown again because it's necessary for consumer expenditure. QE, the banks say that lending was was enabled, but actually it wasn't. It's been highly constrained. Bank of England claim that GDP is up, but asset prices and therefore inequality have increased. And on austerity, I refer you there to Portis and Reed, Jonathan Portis, Howard Reed. Welfare cuts have disproportionately hit low-income families with children, leading to 1.5 million increased child poverty, and the well-known Philip Aston UN report estimating 14 million in poverty and 1.5 million people destitute. So this is a summary of this benign paradise economy, i.e. output GDP produced by highly effective high technology production methodologies then leads to the issuing of debt-free sovereign money, which funds government expenditure and welfare benefits, but only up to the level of that output GDP, so it remains non-inflationary, and also funds basic income for consumer expenditure. The results of this beatific paradigm would be that there wouldn't be austerity, there wouldn't be a crisis, we would see a reduction in poverty and inequality, and an increase in ecological responsibility and in human flourishing. The website there makes these points in a slightly more graphical way for public presentation. And finally, if I may, my book, which Lorena kindly referred to earlier, on basic income and sovereign money, and some comments on it from Nick Pierce, Tom Pally and Bernard Neumaker, which is available from Palgrave. I think I can promote the book without any conscience because I'm on a zero royalty contract with Palgrave, so only they benefit from it. But that's there if you find it of use. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very interested to discuss all of those issues with you now. Over to you, Lorena.
Thank you, Geoff. That was really well timed. This is very interesting. You talked about a lot of aspects related to different income and money. So without further ado, I give the floor to Rajiv, who actually prepared some slides to comment on your intervention. And if you want, Rajiv, you can just share your screen.
Sorry, I'm signed in as a guest.
Guest.
Problem.
So you want me to?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so just let me find. In the meantime, yeah, you can start talking.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lorena.
Do you see the symbol share content at the bottom of the screen? It says share content.
Rajiv, I've made you a presenter, so you can share your screen now if you want.
Let's have a look. Hang on a sec. Let me just find it. Just give me 1 second.
Yeah, in the meantime, I'm just gonna say, because we are quite a few people today, after Alan's and Rajiv's intervention, who wants to ask questions, can please, he please type on the conversation their name so that I can start making a list of questions. Thank you. Go ahead.
Brilliant. I don't know if people see the screen?
Not yet.
No. Okay.
So sorry, let me just hang on a sec. Yeah, can you see that?
We can see you.
Oh, now.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, you've got it.
None of you got your video on, have you?
No, I'm on a desktop, so I don't have a webcam. Right.
We are scared of losing the connection. So.
Okay. Right. So, thank you, Geoff, for a very interesting presentation. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes, just about 3 things. I'm going to place Geoff's argument in context. I'm going to discuss a couple of consequences that arise from his argument, and finally I'm going to just talk about a particular challenge that Geoff's that might be posed to Geoff's argument, i.e. how we might go beyond this particular thought experiment. So the first thing is that there are lots of different arguments for basic income. I mean, it's been dated back hundreds of years. So you've got like Thomas More's Utopia. There's been various waves of it since. And there are various different intellectual traditions that have contributed to arguments for a basic income. So from political philosophy, you've got the work of people like Philippe Van Parijs, who talks about the idea of basic income being an essential component of what he calls real freedom for all. And there's a lively debate in philosophy about that, about different moral justifications for a basic income as a form of to provide a foundation for liberty. Within sociology, there's related work on things such as real-world utopias. So we're talking here about people like Eric Olin Wright, the way in which basic income might be part of a transformative policy to change the nature of capitalism. It could be one step within which we move beyond capitalism. Some of the things that Geoff talked about to do with like economic change. So he referred to the argument about robots and automation. Also, Guy Standing's work on the precariat, the ways in which economic change is used to provide an argument for the provision of a basic income. So, for example, for stand-ins, work on precariat, the idea of people being precarious in precarious forms of existence, a basic income can protect people or provide an essential net social form of social protection. Gender, and here Lorena herself has written quite insightfully on the way in which you might look at a basic income from a gender perspective, the idea which draws and touches on issues in feminist economics. Now, and there are many more different types of argument, but that just gives you a sample of the kind of the context within which Geoff's argument sits. Now, I think though that the argument that Geoff just presented now is quite innovative, in the sense that although it overlaps with some of these other traditions, it's coming at it from a slightly different angle. It's much more macroeconomic in focus, and it touches upon things like monetary theory, and I think other people, and I'll come on to that in a bit further. So what I want to highlight here is the kind of distinctive nature of the argument that's just been presented, and how it forms a distinctive part of the arguments of a basic income. Okay, what are the kind of consequences? I think for me, listening to the presentation and reading the presentation, I think what's interesting about Geoff's argument here is how it would reframe basic debates about a basic income. So, for example, I think one of the points made, and I think this is done by other work in the University of Bath's Institute for Policy Research by researchers such as Luke Martinelli and also Nick Pierce, is the idea of affordability. So one of the common criticisms of a basic income is that, well, an affordable basic income would be inadequate to lift most people out of poverty or inequality. But conversely, if you did have an adequate basic income, it would be prohibitively expensive. And this issue of affordability is one of the key arguments that's used by critics against a basic income. Now, one interesting implication from Geoff's thesis is that it recasts that particular debate. So rather than getting into debates about, well, what's affordability, whether tax and spend could be changed and so on, I think as far as I understand the argument, is that it's saying, well, this is looking at the issue in the wrong way, or it presents an alternative way of looking at the issue. So we saw that Geoff talks about output GDP, and how looking at it from that point of view, it kind of dissolves some of those other debates about basic income, about affordability. Now, if we continue to follow that line of argument that Geoff's presented, it would then kind of lead through into other debates about monetary theory and macroeconomics and the status of that. And I think the other contributors in this seminar who are more well versed than I am on these topics, so I think Alan Shipman and John Law, I don't know if she's around, in the sense that they've both written about the kind of macroeconomic aspects and circular flow of money and so on. And but what would be interesting then is how this then advances, how those other forms of expertise could then directly feed into developing Geoff's argument. And finally, I guess, as with all kind of policies or proposals of this kind, the final challenge is, well, how do we get from here, where we are today, to there? And so in the slides, Geoff discusses the idea that this is a thought experiment, and the idea, as if I've understood correctly, that this is kind of a fully automated economy and so on. But the point is, living as we are in an kind of imperfect world, how do we move to the sort of vision that's set out there? So my remarks were about context. The way in which what I've tried to show is that Geoff's offering a distinctive space within UBI. I've drawn out what I think are some of the implications of this particular argument, and no doubt there are plenty of others, and how that might be developed. But then finally, as with schemes or arguments of this type, the issue of, well, practicality, how do we do it, how do we get to the sort of end point that you envisage. Okay, that's me. Hope that helps.
Thank you, Archie.
I hope Alan will do the same. That does perfectly into your interventions. Alan, I give you the floor, and then we'll have actually a series of as well. Jonko, Susan, Davide. So yeah, Alan.
Should I go ahead, or Alan first?
No,
okay.
Alan is
okay,
the second
okay.
discussant.
Okay.
No, why don't we take the questions first? I know how annoying it is to have a question and then have to wait and wait. I've not got a presentation, so would it be better that way? We take the 4 questions.
No, but
now.
I would rather to stick to my schedule. I'm sorry if I'm pushing, Alan.
Oh, that's all right. In that case, I don't have a presentation. I'll be quite brief.
No, but I mean, a few points that you want to make, or unless you have no points, then I give you the floor to the participants.
Whether I have a valid point is for others to judge.
I
really like these arguments. I really want to agree with everything. I always end up being a devil's advocate, and so maybe I should do that based on something that was mentioned, the godly identity, the macroeconomic accounting identity, which I guess Godley would have, if he were around still, would have said comes from Nicholas Caldor, and there's a sort of 60s discovery that Godley rediscovered. And there is a way of looking at the Godley accounting identity, which basically says an economy like Britain, it's got huge private sector debt, and the private sector's paying that back, and so its savings rate has got to be above its investment rate. Plus, its investment rate is very, very low, and always has been. So you've got savings greater than investment. You've got a current account deficit, and that's been there for ages. We simply don't export as much as we import. And so the government's got to run a deficit, and that is indeed what's pretty much always happened, except for the brief moment when Gordon Brown one year managed to run a surplus. So we have an inbuilt government deficit, and yes, what that's doing really is running up government debt, but doing it necessarily because it's the only way that we stave off a depression as demand is taken out of the economy by the savings surplus and that external deficit. But it does raise the question, do we have enough resources? And to me, the modern money argument is unanswerable. They have to be right. Governments can spend as much money as they want through the sleight of hand that the central bank might be buying up government debt through quantitative easing. But essentially, money is keystrokes and governments can spend what they want. The constraint is, does the government spend more than the available GDP? If it does, there's inflation. Now, the great danger I can see in Geoff's argument is that it applies to a country like the US, which has got the world's currency as the dollar. It can print as much as it likes. It applies in economies like Germany, which have external surpluses and sufficient economic growth that the government is able to balance its books, but is an astonishingly special case and an anomaly in the developed world. And there, if only the Germans would spend more publicly and privately, it would help the rest of the world out. But in the UK, we really look resource constrained. We don't produce as much as we consume. And a skeptical reading of the modern money argument would be, yes, the government must spend us out of recession, but private sector consumption's got to be constrained. It's not just that it's constrained by the amount of debt it's got to repay. It's constrained by the amount of resources, and if we're going to spend money, it's got to be public investment, not private consumption. So the danger of the universal basic income approach will be, yes, it's going to stoke up demand. There's not going to be adequate supply for that demand. The world has excess capacity, but it's mostly in China. Britain doesn't have enough capacity. And so if we boost our demand through that, what is likely to be a consumption-led mechanism, certainly low-income recipients of universal basic income are likely to spend it. Keynesians will see that as an advantage. But in a supply-constrained situation, if that is the UK's situation, it's going to make the situation worse. It will exacerbate our external deficit, and or it will cause inflation. So the sort of nightmare scenario that I'm putting forward is, yes, we have necessarily the government injecting demand to the economy, and we need more of that. But we might actually need a form of rationing, rather like post-war rationing in the UK, so that the government invests it and the private sector doesn't consume it. And that I think is a limitation for a small, underproducing economy like the UK. Not necessarily a limitation for economies like Germany and the US, and there's always a danger of importing modern money style arguments from the US where they might work to a small open economy like the UK where they might not. So that's my sort of big caveat. I really want to be wrong about all of that, and I hope I am. But as a sort of devil's advocacy, it would be interesting to hear a response to that. There's this question which the MMT people do raise about, do you have enough resources in the economy when you stimulate demand, or will it all just result in inflation?
Yes, that's the question, I guess. So now we have two options. Either, Geoff, you want to kind of wrap up and comment on the two discussant interventions, or we go straight into the 4 questions that we have lined up from the participants.
Well, if I could have a brief response. I mean,
Yes.
Thank you for those absolutely excellent, thoughtful responses. They're very helpful to me in trying to finesse and refine my argument. I think perhaps my answer to both Rajiv and Alan is similar. Rajiv was asking how, what are the steps that we could take to get from where we are now to something closer to this other paradigm. And Alan was raising the question of hitting resource constraints if we pump up aggregate consumption in the economy. I'd suggest if it were possible, which it probably isn't, but if we could hypothetically do a couple of things. One is, if we had been able to replace the 166 billion of household debt taken out in 2004 with basic income, what would have been the net effect? Now, it seems to me that if it's exactly the same amount of money ending up in people's spendable accounts, that there would not have been a resource effect. I mean, it is argued by some that if people have got money as basic income just given to them, they will spend it differently or regard it differently if they've got it through a loan that they've taken out. But I'd like to allow myself to ignore that possible factor and say, if we were just to take out 166 billion of household debt and put in 166 billion of basic income, is it not arguable that actually there would have been no change in the macroeconomic variables? And the same with government debt. I mean, if we were able to take that current debt profile, or indeed the amount of money being taken out to fund the crisis intervention with coronavirus, and we're to say, okay, it's not defined as debt, it has no interest payment, it's actually just the same amount of money. If it's the same amount of money but simply defined differently, i.e. not to bear debt, doesn't that leave us in a similar position, not threatened by resource constraints or inflation?
Great, thank you very much. Now we have time to give the floor to the participants. So we have Les, then Susan, then Jonko, then Jose, and then Lorraine. So I will kindly ask you to be brief with your questions and to the point. Maybe we can split it into two so Geoff can answer in two rounds. So
Okay.
Les, Susan, and Jonko.
Okay. I think Geoff has rightly criticized what I see as ideological pretexts for the origin of the current economic problems, and especially the suffering being faced by so many people with low incomes and high debt. But I think they are pretexts, and he's misdiagnosing the pretexts as the causes. In particular, technological automation and monetarist economic concepts, which became much more prominent since the 1980s, were designed and promoted as weapons in a one-sided class war called neoliberalism. And I think to ignore this and to mistake the pretext for the causes, is politically naive and cannot lead to an adequate analysis. And since the 1980s, we've seen a capitalist restructuring process of both the economy and public services to shift power away from the exploited to the exploiters, to shift the wealth generation to the exploited class, to shift people's dependence from public services onto privately consumed items, to decentralize production so as to weaken the bargaining power of labor, etc., etc. And that explains the decline in incomes and the rise in household debt, which was a political strategy, explicitly so, since the 1980s, in order to individualize people and make them more concerned about how they would pay off their debt than how they would engage in any collective struggle for higher incomes or better public services. So I think any proposals for what should be done to improve the situation has to start from understanding that political agenda which has driven everything else, whatever we might call the causes, because those causes themselves need an explanation in that political strategy. Now, just a brief point on UBI. Going back to the Spieneland laws centuries ago, there had been arguments about whether state-provided income or amenities to individuals would effectively serve as a subsidy for low wages. And to a large extent, that's what the Social Security system has done, especially as incomes, the wages have been kept so low. On the other hand, the UBI could be used for just the opposite, to empower people to refuse unattractive offers of super-exploited low-wage jobs and create a livelihood that they find more enjoyable and fulfilling and useful to other people. So that's a persistent contradiction or tension within proposals for UBI. And again, that has to be understood in the wider political context of an exploitative labor system. So I am among many who advocate, who support these proposals for UBI, but only on condition that it's in a wider political framework that allows the recipients, or helps the recipients, to use that income to free themselves from superexploitation, rather than have it serve as a substitute, as a subsidy to employers who pay low wages.
Thank you. Let's go on with Susan and Jonko, and then Geoff will have 10 minutes for you to reply, and then the second round. Susan? Please mute your microphone, Les.
Yes.
Susan, we can't hear you. Susan? Maybe that's...
Hi, hello, I can hear you,
yeah.
sorry.
Here we are.
Hello, apologies.
Yes.
May I ask my question? Thank
Yes,
you.
no, yes.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you very much for a a fantastically neat presentation, and also really constructive engagements with that so far. I think my question does sort of tag on a bit to what's been said a little bit. The first bit is really, the first short question is really around what about developing countries in particular, who have been facing a massive debt expansion since the last financial crisis. How might this work there? The second is about the question of GDP itself, which is in relation to Alan's earlier point. I mean, what actually goes into GDP? And in the context of the UK with 14% in fire, you know, any kind of GDP and income linked to that does not necessarily go into into managing the production side of it, or actually paying for things that we need. So this does relate to a question of whether or not such a proposal requires a much more radical restructuring of production itself in order for it to be sustainable and for it to work. That's it.
Okay, thank you. And then we have Janko. Janko, you've been nominated also in Reggie's presentation, so we wait for your comments.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Geoff, for a really fascinating presentation, and one that cleverly synthesizes quite a lot of topical issues. I really enjoyed that. My question is much more on the practical side. So, I mean, the first one is, yes, I can see that UBI would essentially be tokens for distributing GDP, but GDP, of course, usually we don't know what GDP is right now. There's a lag before we know what GDP is. So how would we actually decide on the level of UBI, given that people need to spend now, even though we don't know what GDP is until later? That led me on to think that, well, this is all a bit confounded as well by if UBI is just replacing household debt, then I'm presuming that households still are able to have other assets. So they may have savings, and of course there's no control over when savings are spent. So you might have a UBI that neatly distributes GDP, however we've defined or measured or estimated that, but then excess demand could actually come from people unexpectedly cashing in savings, which kind of then led me on to the further thought, well, would they even have these savings? Because if you're going to reduce household debt and also public debt, which of course underpins most pension savings, do households even have the potential to save? So I wasn't quite sure how UBI in the end could just replace household debt. It almost sounded as if it would have to replace all of the ways of claiming on GDP.
Thank you very much. I think, Geoff, now you have enough material to reply. So I'll give you the...
I thought you had 4 people. No, just 3.
No, we actually have now 7. So we decided to split into 2 rounds. So you will have 4 more questions later on. So.
Okay, no, thank you then. Well, again, thanks everybody for this really very interesting and contentful discussion. Liev, I agree with a lot of the things you say in terms of the political paradigm and framework. You know, there's a lot about neoliberalism which is very unacceptable, and there's clearly a question of how the political power which determines economic outcomes, which is very much a Marxist view, or the market behavior which determines them, which is the neoliberal view. Now, I'm sympathetic actually to both, but I do think that they interact, i.e., the political system is interactive with the productive nature of the economic structure, i.e. the objective economic productivity. So Marx, famously said that the hand loom gives you feudalism and the power loom gives you capitalism. So that there is an objectivity about the production technology which generates certain sorts of political frameworks. I think that my main worry as a socialist actually is if wage is under threat, is it under threat just by political mechanisms, i.e. rich people saying to poor people, you shouldn't have so much wage, or is it under threat by the technology? I actually do think there is a substantial claim that wage is under threat by the technology, and therefore we need to shift the firepower of the left away from targeting wage to targeting income. That's why I would shift away from concepts of a minimum wage towards a concept of a basic income, which is a fair and reasonable income. And its affordability, we'll come on to that in answer to Susan and Jonquil's question. And again, please feed back to me on these points. I'm just trying to decipher my scribbles that I made when you were making your questions. Susan, you talked about developing country debt. And yeah, I mean, I personally think that should be released and relieved. I've worked in developing countries, but the macroeconomic positioning of their debt is not something that I had to my fingertips in the way that I presented some of these cases of UK indebtedness, both at private sector and government sector levels. You say that we will need to radically differentiate our productivity system, our production system, in order to generate a basic income. I mean, my claim is that it's actually redefining itself in myriad ways every day through all sorts of enzymes in chemical production or paint production or glass floating and all the rest of it, reproducing itself in so many ways that it's the other way around, i.e. the radical restructuring of the production system is happening almost outside of us and generating the need for a basic income to make sure that people's standards of living are upheld. Jonquil, yeah, again, very interesting take on that. In response, I would say that my argument about replacing household debt with basic income was simply an example. I was trying to give an example of how it would have no other effect in engaging with the conversation with Alan earlier on. I mean, my main argument is that basic income should replace wage. Because, well, I should, but needs to replace wage. So if wage is under threat, both by the political environments paradigms that Lev was talking about, and the technological ones that I've been talking about, wage is under threat, and therefore people need income. So I'm arguing that basic income would essentially is necessary to replace the reduction in earned income that 1948 to 2016 graph from the ONS showed has unavoidably taken place. Savings. Yes, I mean, it is a very good point. How would you then manage the whole of this process if you had people able to save, if you had people getting wages, if you had people getting basic income as well? How would you estimate that within the GDP availability? Well, it's a very good practical management question. But all I can say is that whilst we can't get this totally accurate, we have a forecast of capacity utilization at the moment. And indeed, we forward welfare benefits and so on with the same calculation in mind. So it is a challenge, but it's one that I think we face anyway.
Okay, thank you. for being very disciplined again. So now we have Davide, Jose, Loren, Aida, and then I see just Theo raising his virtual hand. So please, Davide, go ahead.
Yes, hello everyone, and thanks a lot, Geoff, for the very, very stimulating presentation. I have mainly 2 points. You have addressed partly some of them. However, I would like to insist in some specific aspects. With respect to developing countries, you've mentioned the role of debt, etc. However, what I would like also to recall is the role of international trade. That is, as long as international trade is performed, is denominated mainly in a bunch of in a reduced number of currencies, mainly dollars, for example, these would act almost automatically as an external constraint on developing countries that do not issue American dollars, that is, all developing countries. And the second aspect has to do with income distribution and the capitalist society. In the last reply, a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned the role of redistribution of income, not only via increase in wages, but also as a more broad and general concept. And that's why UBI is so important. However, my question is, if capitalists do not want wages to increase and redistribute income via increase in wages, why capitalists would like to redistribute income and wealth via UBI or any other measure? Thanks.
Thank you, David. And now we have Jose.
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture. I agree with some points that have already been made. My 2 points, one, I want to hear you comment. You comment on other versions of UBI, but one in specific I think it still needs to be mentioned is the idea of financing universal basic income through dividends, right? A universal dividend. And the point that I bring this now is considering the coronavirus crisis and the bailouts that are necessary for private sectors, this is a window of opportunity to implement that road. And I would like to hear your views and your comments in that. And the second one is still the issue relates to what Alan put forward about the issue of not only affordability, but considering the constraint. I agree very much with the point that we have a chronic insufficiency in demand, but the estimates of output gap that we have, even the ones that we might find more convincing, point towards something like 5% of GDP, 7% of GDP, 8% of GDP. And universal basic income that at a level that lifts people out of poverty is supposed to be take a share of GDP which is much larger than that. And that would come back to the issue of creating a higher demand for imports and constraining and reinforcing the external constraint. So these are 2 points that I would like to hear you expand further on, please.
Thank you. Now we have Loren.
Hi, thanks very much for this interesting presentation. I guess my question is mostly sort of a special case of some of the questions that have been asked previously. Thinking about kind of how households budget, the biggest chunk of a lot of households' budget is housing, and housing is very inelastic demand. So if you give everybody a big transfer in income, and then that kind of shifts out demand curves, but supply for some of these goods is very inelastic, how do you prevent that from becoming a transfer to, say, private landlords just by raising rents because the supply is so inelastic? And I think that maybe if you think of the macroeconomy as the sum of many micro transactions, there can be unexpected distributional consequences from that.
Great. And then we have Aida and Theo, so that we can conclude all the set of questions. Aida? Hello? Maybe then Theo can jump.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Very fascinating. I just wanted to ask something about wages. Wages are under threat by technology, but wages have always been under threat by technology. Every time we have a new technological innovation, there is impact on wages. And in a way, this is something that Schumpeter described as a kind of creative destruction. The fact that we have some wages under threat now doesn't mean that we will have them in the long run. So it may be temporary phenomenon. And therefore, the question I've got is whether you see universal basic income as a way to deal with temporary sort of creative destruction, or you see it in the long run as something that can actually change fundamental structures of society and in fact social relations and production. Thank you.
Is Aida able to speak now, or should we? Because we have a last question. Aida, I think you're muted or something. Hello? Maybe should I move on with Antonis? Antonis, do you want to ask the question and then we'll try to reconnect with Aida?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Can I speak now?
Yes, go.
Okay. So, until now I haven't understood this universal income. Who will, under which way we will have it? I understand that there are two ways. First way, we will have it through taxation. So we have to impose a tax. Guess who will pay this tax? The workers. Second option, we will open the printing machine. We will print money. So this means inflation. So who will burden this inflation? If I am an employer and I hear that tomorrow morning the state will give you, let's say, a kind of universal income, what I will do is to reduce your salary, right? So at the end, it will be nothing in my pocket. And something, a final comment. You have mentioned many times the notion of unearned income. Why we need unearned income? We have got such a huge earned income. If you have a 3D, let's say, printer and you produce an item, the surplus value there is huge, mammoth. So the problem is that we don't take this value. This is the problem. Not that we need unearned income. There is so much income. We have got, there is this value. It's here. We can see it. The problem that it is expropriated by someone else, this is another problem. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it connects a lot with the capital wage relationship. And I mean, in the meantime, if I can ask it's actually it's not a new question, but it really connects with this risk. If I want to be I can be the advocate again. Is about the taxonomy that the monetarist and productivist approach of UBI uses in relations to work and to labor. And there are two sides of the coin here that are completely bypassed in the analysis. One of which is the gender one, the one that feminist political economists have highlighted, which is the point about the reproductive work, which is it's a crucial dimension of the maintenance of livelihood and reproduction of capitalist society that is completely ignored by the employment. So there is this interchangeable use of employment and work that is misleading. And the second one is about the, but yeah, let me stop here and I give the priority to Daida, who finally typed the question. And she said, so if we can comment about the distribution of income in the framework Geoff conceptualized, no wages but profit from capitalists, and say something about the crisis that not necessarily come from banks, but still could affect UBR affordability. So I think with this, you have enough material to talk for at least 30 minutes. So I give you the floor, Geoff.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think I want to repeat the position that I started off with, i.e. that this is not a sort of didactic lecture. It's a set of embryonic thoughts in hypothesis, and therefore I'm never actually very much in favour of the presentation is being followed by what's called questions and answers, because it suggests that the presenter has answers to all the questions. And I'm certainly not the fount of all knowledge on this, so I respect every question that's been raised. I don't necessarily have an answer to it, i.e. I think those questions are very valid parts of an ongoing debate. So I hope you'll allow me to leave some of those questions very validly supported and respected, but not necessarily with a ready answer. However, I'll try to put a bit of reflection on some of them. I mean, Davide said that in capitalist society, capitalists don't want wages to be increased. I mean, you know, most people running capitalist businesses do want demand for their product, and they do recognize that demand for their product is only going to be there if there's some wage. So, I mean, one can take a fairly pernicious view of capitalism and say that there are all these people who want to impoverish the working class. Or you could take a more pragmatic view and say, well, actually, they want people who to express demand for their products. That doesn't leave the capitalist system without any critique. There is clearly a lot of critique. But the capitalist mentality may not be so much against wages for consumption as you were suggesting there. Jose, I'm just again trying to... oh yes, the coronavirus bailouts. It is a window of opportunity. Absolutely, it is a huge window of opportunity, because the furlough scheme, as it's been defined in the UK, and the financing of that furlough scheme leave the economy open to one huge hit, i.e., first of all, fraud, because you know, companies that can claim people are furloughed when in fact they're working from home, companies that can claim furlough compensation when in fact that company hasn't experienced or suffered any reduction in its revenues, which is the case for some companies. So A, it is subject to a lot of fraud, and B, yes, huge amounts of cost. I mean, imagine you're meeting the cost of 80% of the salary, the first tranche of salary anyway, for a large number of people. And my point would be, is that sustainable through the gilt markets by borrowing to issue that money? And actually, is it fair? Because in any case, that will generate a financing cost payable to the financial sector. So I would certainly be arguing that the better solution to the coronavirus environment is a basic income directed straight to people who need the income, and B, that what funding is needed comes through sovereign money rather than debt-bearing money, which will take up an obligation to the financial sector for forever, virtually. So I agree. And you also mentioned the issue that the output gap is 5 to 8% of GDP. Yeah, that's a very valid point. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we can't. No economy can afford to pay a basic income greater than the value of what it produces. And Alan made this point earlier on, and that's absolutely true and valid. We're just talking about a restructuring of the nature of expenditure, consumer disposable income, demand and output. And that has shown, I think, unambiguously an increased role for unearned income in the structure, which Antonis was questioning, and I'll come back to that. Lorraine, on housing, yeah, I mean, I accept that there could be all sorts of similar effects, but on the other hand, I wouldn't necessarily be seeing basic income as anything necessarily hugely different from waged income. I'm arguing that waged income is under threat and needs supplementing or eventually maybe replacing by a basic income. So that's one of the many questions which I don't claim to have a direct answer to. I think they're all very valid questions which need to enter into the ongoing debate. Theo, wages are always under threat. What's different? It's a temporary phenomenon, changing the structures of society. Well, yeah, I mean, there have always been depressions of wages, as in the 1930s and so on and so forth. I think I'm claiming, and a number of other commentators are claiming, that this isn't a temporary phenomenon. I mean, the graph from 1948 showed it's a very long-term phenomenon in the reduction of earned labour income in the economy. And yes, I think it will change structures of society. I mean, if we were to get anywhere close to this totally automated world, this mythical thought experiment, and it did allow us to have more leisure, which we already have. I mean, the working week has come down from 100 hours a week through 70 hours a week down now to 35 hours a week, and it's only likely to go down further. Therefore, that does, we could regard that as a threat, or we could regard it as an opportunity to reconfigure the way we live our lives, and that there may be a different structure to that life. It's a huge question, but I don't think it's necessarily a destructive point. I mean, it can allow a lot of options, a lot of flourishing. Do people necessarily really want to spend 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. in an office, or 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. in a factory? Well, they may find part of that creative. Some of them may find it bullshit jobs and wish they could get out. I worked in a factory, and I remember at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, people were lined up for the bell to go to run off. So, I mean, work has an important role, but there's a work-life balance, of course, and maybe it gives us an opportunity to emphasize life and not necessarily be constrained by work in the way that we sometimes are. And Antonis then summarized the whole thing really by saying, well, how do we pay for UBI? Do we pay for it by taxation? This will be the poor pay for it. Now, I'm not arguing that at all. I mean, some of my colleagues actually in the UBI movement are arguing that it can be paid for by 3% increase in taxation. That's the very point I'm not arguing, because as you say, that would take demand out of the economy. I'm arguing that it would be funded by sovereign money. You then call this, we're printing money and creating inflation. And this does come back to the earlier discussion with Alan, that, yeah, I mean, we would release money, produce money, as we do today, within the constraint of the productive capability of the economy. And Ida, did you get a question in there? I couldn't hear you. No, she's still on.
The question is typed. So it's the one Did you read the... You mean the Aida's question?
Yeah, did she come in with one?
Yeah, so is he going to comment about the distribution of income in the framework, self-conceptualize, no wages or profits from capitalists, and say something about crises that not necessarily come from banks, but still could affect UBI affordability?
I'm sorry, I lost a lot of those words, Lorena.
Yeah, I think if you look at the chat, on the left side, you have an icon with vignette. And I think if you open it, you can read the conversation.
Vignette, minimize my video. More options. I'm afraid I can't find that either. I got the comment about gender equality, and yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important part of the argument, and colleagues of mine have written far more eloquently than I have about that. But all part of the very relevant and poignant points that are being made in the basic income debate.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is so much that has been said, and there are so many strings, that we can pull out of this, because it's totalizing in a way. So it's like, it looks at consumption, you look at technology. I mean, I like also this idea of technology. Understanding the technological change versus wage tensions in historical sense. I agree with you. It's really important. But yeah, no, it's been like a very interesting discussion, and I mean, we really thank you so much for being, so open to us and to our doubts. We also have ongoing reflections, and there is no definite answers to this, especially because timing and politics is such an flux that it's hard to make sense of a lot of things at the moment. But I think someone is typing. Is anyone who wants to intervene? And any concluding remarks? We have about 5 minutes now from the audience. I can see John Cole, Theo, Alan is typing.
I may not have been paying attention, but I missed the answer to Les's point right at the beginning. Why not just try and get employers to pay more and raise the earned income rather than having to raise unearned income?
Well, I mean, my question was more about the political power necessary to gain higher wages, not persuading employers, but that's a different question.
But wouldn't it be preferable to push the private sector to raise wages?
Well, when in the last several centuries has that ever happened?
The minimum wage, maybe?
Well, that was won through numerous deaths of workers in conflict before the minimum wage was established.
We used to have trade unions which were allowed to push wages up, although that generated the debate about were they causing inflation. I'm fairly convinced there was empirical evidence that they were the response to inflation and not the cause.
Yeah, that's true.
But I was interested. Geoff may have given this, and I may just not have listened. But I was interested in Geoff's answer to that. Why unearned income as the emphasis?
Well, because I'm claiming in the hypothesis that unearned income increase is an inevitability of the technology. So, I mean, to give one example, I was down at a Fiat engine plant down in Termoli in the south of Italy. They were producing 2,300 engine blocks a day with 2 employees in the whole plant. Now, as you see that level of increase of productivity, in that case, funneling the whole of the value of 2,300 engine blocks a day into the wages of 2 employees becomes pretty impossible. And that's why I deploy this thought experiment of a totally automated economy. And in the totally automated economy, there simply are no wages. And I admit, of course, that's not exactly the case, but I'm saying that there are strong elements of that in the present production matrix. So therefore, if we could solve it all by wage, then I'm fine by that. Let's solve it all by wage. And that's, 1960s onwards, socialist position. I am worried. My worry is that actually we can't fix it by wage, and therefore we need to fix it by income.
Yeah. Les, you want to say something? Or? No.
Yeah. Just the final point. I mean, at one point when Geoff was replying to my comments, he used the phrase a UBI instead of a minimum wage. I'm not sure whether you meant that, but that is exactly what I meant about how, as in the Spiegelman law debates, a UBI in whatever form it takes can readily become a subsidy for low wages, and in order to prevent that use or outcome, it's essential to have a minimum wage strictly enforced. So it sets a baseline, which then increases the bargaining power of people for whether to take particular employment possibilities.
Yeah, I have to do a little bit of self-advertisement, but I wrote a paper on Finland case and the technology and share. Because the point, Geoff, is that, unless you alter the social relations of production, capitalism still relies on extracting labor value and surplus labor value. So it's, if you look to take the Marxist sense, obviously. So it's really difficult to alter this dialectic that regulates and makes the system survive.
Well, you can't get, frankly, much further left-wing than my colleague Guy Standing. And Guy and I are very good friends, and he's probably further to the left politically than I am. But Guy would certainly argue that a basic income would increase workers' bargaining position because they wouldn't, if you like, have their backs to the wall when negotiating wage. I'm not at all against the minimum wage. What I'm worried about is pinning all our hopes on that if there aren't the jobs available because the technology displaces the jobs. So I'm all in favour of wage. I'm all in favour of high wages, minimum wages, and I don't even like the idea of minimum wage. I like to see maximum wage, of decent wages. But I'm worried that the production matrix is changing in such a way that it won't allow us to rely on that strategy. We all have a social concern for people who are poor and low-income families and so on. I'm concerned that wage may no longer be the solution that it was 50 years ago.
Yeah, no, I see your point. I think it's a fair question. I wonder in the case of developing countries where you will see massive shop floor, sweatshop, like with, thousands of unskilled labor still really fit for purpose. So I think there is also an uneven development dimension in that. But yeah, I take the point of view and eye on that. I'm really sorry, but we need to end this amazing seminar. And thanks again for joining us. And this has been recorded. So unless someone is against, I think we're going to edit and then upload it on our ITAD website. Alan is writing something, but I don't know if you want. Do you want to speak? Alan, now we are 12, so you can speak freely. Without need to type. Many thanks, Geoff. Okay, great.
Thanks, Lorraine.
I was just thanks. So thanks a lot again, and we'll keep it. Hopefully, we'll have actually quite a few working on UBI. So it's good to have keep the discussion ongoing.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks for the participation.
Yeah, great.
Thanks very much.
Yes, and Alexi, please. We'll make sure that the recording is safe, and I know that there is a special command for that. Because otherwise, if we just close the conversation, you will be deleted. So I'm sure Alexi knows, but yeah, just to make sure that this is not going to happen. All right, guys, have a nice sunny day. And
thank you.
Thanks, Geoff.